What if I told you the United Kingdom didn't conquer the Middle East with armies, but with loans? And what if an empire that once ruled 3 continents collapsed, not from losing wars, but from running out of money? In the late 1800s, the Ottoman Empire was drowning in debt. European banks, especially from Britain, stepped in, financing railways, seizing taxes, and controlling budgets. Without firing a single shot, foreign powers took ownership from the inside. This is how debt destroyed sovereignty and how bankers, not soldiers, reshaped the Middle East. By the late 1800s, the world was changing fast. Industrial powers were rising, global trade was expanding, and old empires were starting to crack. At the center of global finance stood the United Kingdom. Britain controlled shipping lanes. British banks financed governments. London had become the financial capital of the world. But far from Europe, another empire was struggling. The Ottoman Empire, once a dominant power across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, was collapsing under decades of war, mismanagement, and failed modernization. By the mid-19th century, the Ottomans were desperately short of cash. Military reforms were expensive. Railways needed construction. Ports required upgrades. Government salaries went unpaid. So in 1854, during the Crimean War, the Ottoman state took its first foreign loan, mainly from British and French banks. It would not be the last. Over the next 20 years, the empire borrowed repeatedly from European financiers. Each loan came with high interest rates. Each agreement pledged future tax revenues. Each deal weakened Ottoman independence. By 1875, the situation became catastrophic. The empire officially defaulted on its debt. It simply could not pay. This was a turning point. European creditors panicked, and Britain stepped in. In 1881, European powers forced the Ottoman government to accept the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a foreign-controlled institution that collected Ottoman taxes directly. Customs duties, salt taxes, tobacco revenues, stamp taxes, all were placed under European supervision. British and French officials now managed large parts of Ottoman finances. This was not occupation, but it was financial control. From that moment on, key economic decisions in Istanbul required foreign approval. The empire still existed on maps, but its wallet belonged to Europe. During the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II, attempts were made to resist Western pressure. Yet the debt machine was already in motion. European banks dictated railway projects. Foreign investors controlled infrastructure. Strategic regions were open to British influence. And slowly, Britain began positioning itself across Ottoman territories, especially in the Middle East. Why? Because debt gave leverage, and leverage created access. Access to ports, access to trade routes, access to political decisions. This was Britain's new imperial strategy. No armies, no invasions, just contracts, interest payments, and financial dependency. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had effectively lost economic sovereignty, and Britain had learned something powerful. You don't need to conquer a nation if you control its debt. This was the beginning of a financial takeover that would reshape the Middle East forever. Debt alone was powerful, but Britain wanted something more permanent. It wanted infrastructure. Because whoever controls infrastructure controls movement, controls trade, controls armies, and controls the future. By the late 1800s, railways had become the backbone of empires. They moved soldiers, they transported goods. They connected capitals to distant provinces. Inside Ottoman territory, railway construction exploded. But the empire couldn't fund these projects itself. So once again, it turned to Europe. British banks stepped forward. French financiers followed. And soon, foreign investors began dictating where tracks would be laid. Railway concessions were not simple business deals. They were political tools. Each contract gave foreign companies long-term control over land, stations, and revenue. Entire corridors of Ottoman territory came under European economic influence. Britain focused heavily on routes that protected its imperial lifeline to India, especially waterways and transport links near the Suez Canal. The canal was Britain's shortcut to Asia, so London ensured it remained under British dominance. By 1875, Britain had secretly purchased Egypt's shares in the canal, turning it into a British-controlled artery of global trade. At the same time, Ottoman railways were being quietly divided among European powers. But Britain wasn't alone anymore. A new rival entered the game, Germany, backed by Deutsche Bank. Berlin launched the ambitious Baghdad Railway project designed to connect Europe directly to Mesopotamia. For Britain, this was alarming. A German-controlled rail line reaching the Persian Gulf would threaten British supremacy in the Middle East. Suddenly, Ottoman debt became a geopolitical battleground. Britain increased diplomatic pressure. It expanded banking influence. It strengthened ties with Gulf leaders, and it worked to block German access to key ports. This wasn't open conflict. It was economic chess. Every railway mile mattered. Every loan agreement shifted balance. Every customs contract altered power. Meanwhile, inside Ottoman cities, European financial institutions operated freely. British advisors reviewed budgets. Foreign engineers managed ports. Western companies controlled mining and shipping. Even local taxation systems were shaped by creditor demands. The empire still had a sultan. It still had flags. But major economic arteries were known, and Britain understood something crucial. Political control follows economic control. Once railways, ports, and customs revenues were lost, real sovereignty was gone. By the early 1900s, Britain had positioned itself across strategic Ottoman territories without formal colonization. No invasion headlines, no battlefield declarations, just financial agreements, infrastructure contracts, and permanent dependency. This was empire building in the modern age. Not through conquest, but through credit. And the Ottomans were trapped inside it. What began as loans for modernization had become a system of foreign domination. A quiet takeover, executed by bankers, secured by railways, and enforced by debt. And this growing financial grip would soon set the stage for something even bigger. A war that would finally dismantle the Ottoman Empire and redraw the Middle East forever. By 1914, the Ottoman Empire was barely holding together. Decades of debt, foreign control over finances, and growing pressure from European powers. Then came the spark. World War I. When the conflict erupted, the Ottomans made a fateful choice. They aligned with Germany. For Britain, this changed everything. What had once been a financial struggle now became a military emergency. Ottoman lands sat across Britain's vital supply routes to India. Oil-rich regions were suddenly strategic, and the Middle East became a battlefield. Britain did not just fight with soldiers, it fought with promises. In 1915, British officials secretly began negotiations with Arab leaders, offering independence if they revolted against Ottoman rule. The key figure was Sharif Hussein bin Ali, guardian of Mecca. Britain pledged support for an independent Arab state. In return, Hussein launched what became known as the Arab Revolt. Ottoman forces were weakened from within. Railways were sabotaged. Supply lines collapsed. And British troops advanced from Egypt and Mesopotamia. But while Britain was making promises to Arab leaders, it was making different promises behind closed doors. In 1916, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement divided Ottoman territories into British and French spheres of influence. No Arabs were consulted. No local voices were heard. Maps were drawn in European offices. Straight lines cut through deserts. Ancient regions were split apart. This was not liberation, it was repetition. By 1918, Ottoman armies collapsed. Istanbul sued for peace. And the empire officially ended after more than 600 years of rule. But the fall of the Ottomans did not bring freedom. It brought mandates. Britain took control of Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. France claimed Syria and Lebanon. What had started as financial influence had now become direct political control. Debt had opened the door. War pushed it wide open. British administrators replaced Ottoman officials. British companies entered oil fields. British advisors shaped new governments. The same regions once tied to Ottoman loans were now under British authority. And the Arab leaders who had helped defeat the Ottomans, they were sidelined. The independence they were promised never fully arrived. Instead, the Middle East was reorganized to serve European interests. Trade routes, military bases, energy resources, all carefully positioned. Britain had achieved what debt alone could not. Territorial dominance. Not through conquest in the traditional sense, but through a chain reaction. Loans led to leverage. Leverage led to influence. Influence led to war. And war delivered control. This was the final transformation. Financial dependency had evolved into imperial rule, and the borders created during this period would shape conflicts for generations. The Ottoman debt trap had done its job. It had dismantled an empire, and it had helped Britain redesign the Middle East forever. After World War I, the Middle East did not gain true independence. Instead, it entered a new phase of foreign control. This time, it was legal. In 1920, under the authority of the League of Nations, former Ottoman lands were placed under mandates. The word sounded temporary, but the reality was colonial. Britain received control over Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. France took Syria and Lebanon. These borders were not drawn by historians. Not by tribes, not by local communities. They were drawn by European diplomats. Straight lines across deserts. Ancient regions split apart. Different ethnic and religious groups forced into single political units. This was state building without consent. Britain installed friendly rulers, created new administrations, and positioned military bases across strategic locations. But one resource above all else reshaped British priorities. Oil. In 1908, massive oil reserves had been discovered in Persia. Soon after, similar reserves were identified in Mesopotamia. Modern warfare and industry now depended on petroleum. And Britain moved fast. British-backed companies gained access to Iraqi oil fields. Pipelines were planned. Ports were expanded. Energy security became imperial policy. Iraq, in particular, became central to Britain's strategy. Not because of democracy, not because of development, But because it sat between India, the Mediterranean, and Persian oil, Britain controlled its finances, advised its government, and stationed troops to suppress uprisings. Local resistance emerged almost immediately. In 1920, a massive revolt erupted in Iraq against British rule. Tribal leaders, religious authorities, former Ottoman officers, they demanded independence. Britain responded with air power. Villages were bombed, rebellions crushed, control was maintained. Meanwhile, Palestine became another flashpoint. British authorities struggled to balance competing promises made during the war. Arab leaders had been promised independence. Zionist organizations had been promised a homeland. These contradictions created permanent instability. Once again, financial decisions made decades earlier were shaping political realities. The Ottoman debt crisis had opened the door. World War I had forced it wider. Now mandates locked foreign control into place. Britain had achieved what banks alone could not: direct administration, resource access, strategic dominance. But the cost was enormous. Artificial borders produced fragile states. Foreign-backed rulers lacked legitimacy. Communities were divided. And resentment grew. The Middle East was no longer governed from Istanbul. It was managed from London and Paris. This was not liberation. It was redesign, a region reshaped to serve imperial interests, and the consequences would echo for generations. Because when borders are created by outsiders, instability becomes permanent. The Ottoman Empire was gone, but its debt legacy remained. What Britain helped create was not just new borders, it created a new system. A system where financial dependence replaced sovereignty, where foreign capital shaped domestic politics, and where economic pressure became a tool of influence. Across the Middle East, newly formed states inherited fragile institutions. They had artificial borders, weak economies, and governments designed to serve external interests. Many relied heavily on British advisors, British military protection, and British-backed financial systems. This model became a template, not only for the Middle East, but for much of the post-imperial world. Loans funded development, but repayments drained budgets. Infrastructure projects favored foreign companies. Local industries struggled to compete. Political leaders learned that survival depended on external approval. This pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century. Even after formal independence, economic leverage remained. Oil contracts were negotiated abroad. Currencies were tied to Western markets. Security agreements came with conditions. The empire had ended, but influence had not. Britain eventually withdrew. Yet another power stepped forward. The United States. Washington inherited much of London's strategic footprint. Military bases, energy partnerships, financial institutions. The same corridors once protected for British trade were now secured for American interests, and the logic stayed the same. Economic pressure first, political alignment second, stability last. Today, many Middle Eastern countries still carry heavy external debt. They negotiate with international lenders, adjust policies to meet financial conditions, and struggle to balance sovereignty with survival. Modern organizations like the International Monetary Fund now play roles similar to 19th-century creditor commissions. Budget reforms, austerity measures, privatization demands. Different era, same mechanics. Historians widely agree that the Ottoman debt crisis marked a turning point. It showed how finance could dismantle empires, how loans could replace armies, and how balance sheets could redraw maps. The borders created after World War I remained largely unchanged, and many of today's conflicts trace directly back to decisions made in European offices more than a century ago. Debt opened the door, war forced it wider, and mandates locked foreign control into place. What began as financial assistance became structural domination. This is why trust in Western powers collapsed across the region, why nationalism rose, why revolutions followed, because people eventually realized their future had been mortgaged before they were ever consulted. The Ottoman debt trap was not just about money, it was about power. It proved that empires no longer needed conquest. They needed contracts. They needed creditors. They needed dependency. And Britain was among the first to master this modern form of empire, a system that reshaped the Middle East, destabilized generations, and still echoes in global politics today. Because once a nation loses control of its finances, everything else becomes negotiable.